Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm Al, and I from alanrural.com, and today I am joined by the one, the only, John Fisher 2.0. Now, John Fisher is an expert in philosophy. I know almost nothing about philosophy. There's this one time that that Jay Dyer said, when it comes to philosophy, I'm extremely ignorant. That's probably one of the only true things he said about me. But the point is, yes, I am extremely ignorant in philosophy, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert there. However, John Fisher 2.0 is an expert in philosophy.
I would not call myself an expert because, to me,
no, you're better than me. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
So therefore, more of an expert than me. So therefore, he has been reading up. I was just talking to him about a week ago, and we're going over some projects we're each doing, and he's been researching models of the Trinity. And as you know, I have an interest in Islamic apologetics, and Muslims flinch when they hear the T word, if you know what I mean. And of course, I have an interest in that kind of apologetics, and John's from a Muslim country, so
technically, Lebanon is a country where, although the majority is Muslim, a slight majority, Christians have a pretty dominant minority population, and we actually have some of the higher offices in the political sphere. So, for example, our president actually has to be a Maronite Catholic.
Yeah, but the prime minister has to be a Muslim, right?
Yeah, of course. This is how we avoid sectarian violence.
Yeah. Well, the point is there's a lot of Muslims there. It may not be a Muslim country, but there's a lot of Muslims there. And so therefore, it's very important to both of us. And of course, when you talk with the Muslims, there's two things that they say. One is the Trinity. The other one's corruption of the Bible. I mean, if you're going to go and talk to a Muslim kid on the streets of Morocco or Pakistan or Turkey or whatever, you name the country, that's the two things they'll throw out. Oh, yeah, you guys got that weird 3-in-1 God. And of course, it says in the Quran that the third person is the Virgin Mary. Muhammad got a third of the Trinity wrong. Poor guy. But then there is also the corruption of the Bible. And I think today, so it's important we talk about this Trinity in terms of the more sophisticated arguments. And John has been doing a lot of research into certain models of the Trinity from a philosophical perspective. And he's been doing all this work, and he was explaining a lot of it to me over the phone. I was pretty impressed. And I'm a student at his feet. John, take it away.
Awesome. So currently, if you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you should find a huge host of models of the Trinity. And the tricky part about going to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is some of it can be very inaccessible unless you know some of the philosophical jargon, because it relies on a lot of references to philosophical ideas of logic, composition, and causality, all this stuff. So if you do go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and there might be sections or bits you don't understand, that's perfectly fine. However, I do think it's generally accurate. The author of the encyclopedia, funny enough, is Dale Tuggy, who is a Unitarian, but he is a very interesting guy in terms of his background. He is someone who was a Trinitarian at one point, converted over, became a Unitarian. Although if you ask him, he'll say it's less about the arguments against the Trinity, although I'm pretty sure that would have played something into it, and more along the lines of the fact that he found a lot of the Unitarian arguments made by American Unitarians very convincing. Although if you're somebody like me, you're not really going to put a lot of stock into what 17th century Americans have to say about the Bible. I mean,
or about anything. Zing! I'm sure I got some American listeners I just offended.
Yeah, well, read.
By the way, don't listen to 17th century Canadians either. I mean, technically, we didn't exist in the 17th century. And technically, neither did you. But yeah, no, just pretty much the British in the last 500 years have been.
But in terms of if you want
same with the French.
Right, but in terms of like going for all the academic literature, if you want to explore it further, Tuggy is actually very methodical. He has quite a few resources you could begin to look up. If there's one model that might interest you over the others, feel free to start there. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, written by the philosopher H.E. Baber. Harriet Baber is also a pretty good source to start into it. Baber actually has a book on the Trinity herself, and I've read it. It's actually not too bad. She uses a lot of references from like mathematical philosophy, like structure as a way of explaining it, and she actually explains the processions by a philosophical concept of grounding. For those of you who might not know how this works in the philosophy of math, think of it like this. You have the number 2, but you also have things that the number 2 grounds in terms of their own existence. So you have the number 2, and then you have a set of all numbers where it's actually just the number 2. So a set of one number, which is 2. So the set containing 2 is not the number 2, but it is grounded in the number 2 in a sense. And then you could have a set within a set. So you could have the number 2 in a set in its own set. So something like that. So this is kind of like the lengths you have to go to in order to understand philosophical explanations. They'll pull from everything. They'll pull from the philosophy of math. They'll pull from causality. They'll pull from understandings in the philosophy of time. But I'm just going to break it down very simply in this episode, just to give you the basic concept of what the logical problem of the Trinity is, and also how one answer which I actually find as of now to be the most promising. So, Alan, would you like to start from there?
Well, question. You quoted 2 dictionaries of philosophy. Am I correct?
Yes, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
So how many are there, like in terms of encyclopedias of philosophy?
Those are the 2 most prominent ones. There is also one from Routledge. Routledge also has one written by Daniel Howard Schneider. And it's actually pretty good, too, in terms of providing critiques. Schneider himself is an atheist, but oddly enough, he's if you read his take on Peter Van Inwagen's understanding of the Trinity, which is also the one I more lean to, he's actually much nicer about it than Tuggy is. And Baber herself actually wrote papers defending Peter Van Inwagen's model. So if you're going to understand where I'm most sympathetic to, I guess you can already get a hint there. It's that relative identity notion, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Should we start with the logical problem?
So, is there an Oxford dictionary of philosophy?
There might be. I'm not sure. Those I usually read the Stanford Encyclopedia and the Internet Encyclopedia because they're peer reviewed. If Oxford has one, I imagine it's peer reviewed as well, but it's not as prominent, or at least it's not one I've heard of.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, let's start with the logical problem you said.
Oh, okay. So in the English language, we have the word is. So when we use the word is, there's 2 senses in which we can use it. We could use it as the is of identity or the is of predication. So when we say the is of identity, we mean something like Clark Kent is Superman. So it means that the 2 things are co-equal. They're just names for the same thing. So for example, if I was to say Superman, I'm also referencing Clark Kent. Those 2 names refer to the same object. There are many names of referring to one thing. And funny enough, you could treat them like an is of predication, which is when we use it to say that something has a particular quality. So I could say Clark Kent is Superman, or one better, I can say Bill Clinton is the 42nd president. Those would be the is of identity. But I could also say things like Bill Clinton is old. Now, it doesn't mean I can treat those is the same way. So, for example, I could say the 42nd president is Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is the 42nd president interchangeably. It doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. But if I said old is Bill Clinton, that would be weird. Like, is Bill Clinton just oldness itself? Like, no, like Bill Clinton has a property of being old. Also, identity allows you to exchange synonyms. So, for example, if I was to say Bill Clinton, the 42nd president, and Hillary Clinton's husband, I could use those interchangeably too. I could, if I know Bill Clinton is the 42nd president.
That's pretty much only on paper, by the way, these days. They don't even live together anymore. But I'll just.
Okay.
So, sorry, I had to take that little jab there.
I'm pretty sure it's nothing he did. But all right. So if I was to say Bill Clinton is the 42nd president and Bill Clinton is Hillary Clinton's husband, I can say the 42nd president is Hillary Clinton's husband. But if I was to say Bill Clinton is old and Richard Gere is old, it doesn't therefore follow that Bill Clinton is Richard Gere, because two things can be old, but it doesn't mean they're the same thing. So that's the basic gist of the difference. So we're either stuck saying that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is God in the sense that they're all equal, or in the sense that that we're predicating God to each of them. But each one of these scenarios seems to have a bit of a problem. So let's go with the first one. What happens? Well, if we say that they're identity claims, well, that's bad, because then we get this result. The Father is God. The Son is God. By the same principle with Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and the 42nd president, we could also infer that Jesus is the Father. But that's modalism. That's a heresy. That's condemned.
Sabellianism.
That's Sabellian. Yes. Sabellian, of course, is very famous as a heretic for saying that they were various personas that the one God portrayed. So that's bad. You can't have that. But what about the other option? Well, here's its own problems. If I have three apostles in a room, so for example, Peter is an apostle, James is an apostle, and Paul is an apostle, I have three apostles. But if Jesus is God, the Son, who is the Son, if the Holy Spirit is God, and the Father is God, don't I have three gods? That's tritheism, that's polytheism. And we don't want that either. So you can't really have either scenario. Now, where does this leave us? What models of the Trinity can we give where we can get away from that issue? Because it's not just enough that we avoid that consequence. We also have to give some sort of story behind why that consequence doesn't follow. So if you're like me, one of the first reactions is, okay, we're not really saying that the Father is God and the Son is God in the same way. What we're saying is the Father is a person, the Son is a person, and the Holy Spirit is a person. And then what we're saying is that all these three persons are one being. Okay, so when you say are one being, well, are is just another way of saying is. So is it the fact that they are one being in the sense of predication or identity? Because you're just going to have the same problem again, and we don't want that. So at this point, now we have the problem. You want to get into some ways in which philosophers have tried to reconcile this issue.
Well, I mean, it seems pretty self-explanatory. You just got to work with categories, I think, right? Is that true?
Yeah, it is true. Metaphysical categories are going to be your kind of bread and butter. So the first maybe kind of Trinity solution is like a social Trinitarianism. So social Trinitarians want to start from the position of the three persons, and they want to explain how they come together to be one God. So if you follow like the popular apologist and philosopher William Lane Craig, he would explain Foundations for a Christian Worldview. That's it.
Yeah, as soon as you said social Trinitarianism, I'm like, where's William Lane Craig's book? Oh, it's in my bookshelf. Because he talks about like Latin Trinitarianism, social Trinitarian, like all these fancy, like, look at this stuff. This is advanced stuff. Mm-hmm. Of course, the light's reflecting off it and you can't see what's on the page. But I mean, like advanced stuff here. Do you have this book?
I do not, but I listened to an interview where Craig gives his position. And Craig's position is the following. I don't find it convincing, but I'll try to be as charitable as possible. And we'll take it from there. So Craig is what's called a Trinity monotheist.
Wait, I'm getting a call. I think it's important.
Oh, no worries. All right, audience. So Craig is a follower of Trinity monotheism. There is only one God because there is one Trinity, and the Trinity is the one God. Well, that leads us to some issues. The first, of course, is it leads to partialism, or another way of saying it is it leads to a violation of the Catholic doctrine of divine simplicity. Now, Craig has a very simple way around it, which is to say divine simplicity is bogus. It's not really legitimate. It's bad. Christians should give it up. It's like, why even bother with it? So he's okay just pushing that to the side. And that's fair enough. A second reason why this doesn't work is it seems like Craig is doing what the Athanasian Creed tells us not to do, which is dividing the substance. And by dividing the substance, he runs into a huge issue. So, but first, let's actually explain kind of the metaphysics or his kind of explanation. So Craig is going to explain his Trinity model in the sense of a soul and centers of consciousness. So God is one soul. He is one spiritual being, but he is a spiritual being who has three centers of consciousness. And these centers of consciousness are basically persons within their own rights. They will, think, feel. They have all these personal traits and attributes that are exclusive to one another. So if the Son is to think, I am God the Father, per impossibly, of course, he would be wrong because he is not the Father, he is the Son. So that's how that would work. You have three consciousnesses, the one of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but they all exist in one soul. And fun, people trying to empty the ocean with a seashell. Let us do this. Yeah, okay. So
the reason I'm calling myself Al is because it sounds Arabic. Al Rule.
Yeah, It reminds me of the Batman villain. You know the one I'm talking about? Ra's al Ghul.
Oh, Ra's al Ghul. Ra's al Ghul.
Yeah. Okay. Although to go to Hillary's
Ra's al Rule.
Ra's al Ghul. Think about that for the future. But to go to Haley's comment, I think she is alluding to that very famous story where Saint Augustine of Hippo was telling a child, wait, why are you trying to dig a hole? He says, to fill the ocean with it. Well, you can't really fit the ocean into a hole. And he says, well, you can't really fit the Trinity into your own mind. And Augustine is taken aback by this. Now, it's sad to say I really love this story, but I was really heartbroken to hear that it was a medieval story without any historical foundation, but them's the breaks. So I
Don't
love
let
it.
the truth get in the way of a good story.
Well,
except maybe in religion, that might be the one exception. You don't want to fool with truth here, but
there is a good truth to it there is a sense of mystery to the Trinity that I think every Trinity model needs to bear out. If at the end of it you can't say this part of the Trinity is mysterious, we don't know how. If you can't say that about your model, I'm just disregarding it. That's my own personal opinion. But just to go back to Craig's model, so Craig would explain that each of these three centers of consciousness are divine, but they are not God. The soul or the Trinity itself is the one God. They're divine. The Trinity is divine, but they're divine in two senses of the word. And this leads to what another philosopher, Brian Leftow, calls Plantingian Arianism. Why Arianism? Well, the Plantingian part is just a dig at Cornelius Plantinga, but the Arianism part is there was another heretic who also believed that you could be God in two ways, Arius. So that's not good. And another issue is it seems to, the concept behind it is true. I would agree with that. So the other issue with Craig's model isn't just the fact that you have one divine one God. It's that you have three divine beings. But if you have three divine beings, that seems to just sneak polytheism through the back door by saying that they're all, part of the same substance. And there's an atheist philosopher.
Isn't that what Van Til said?
What did he say?
Three beings or something. I mean, of course, he's trying not to be polytheistic, but that just sounds weird.
Three, right? God is one being, so that's something we can't take away from it. But Daniel Howard Snyder, who's an atheist, actually pointed this out. What exactly, if you have three divine beings, doesn't that entail polytheism? Craig's response is, yeah, no, but they don't exist independent of the divine substance. And then Snyder points out, well, okay, but the divine substance doesn't exist apart from the persons. Like what's the deal? And that's
Snyder's a tricky one.
No, Snyder's right though. I mean, that's what happens when you reject divine simplicity. Like you have to have a kind of explanation why these persons are inseparable from the substance, and unless you kind of have a way of making that distinction with a doctrine like simplicity, it's really going to hurt you out in the long run. So I don't think Craig's model works that well. That's my own personal opinion. But so that's the first model to discuss.
So, okay, pause for a second. You mentioned the issue, and of course, there's a certain person who always talks about this online. I won't say his name, but he always talks about divine simplicity versus the teachings of the one and only Gregory Palamas.
Yeah, Palamas also believes in divine simplicity. I don't know why.
There you go. I know. I was waiting for that. Thank you so much.
Yep. Palamas is always quick to remind people that he doesn't believe the activities of God are separate from his being. So he's always quick to point out their unicity. And how that's parsed out, Palamas isn't a systematic theologian, but to be fair, very few are. So that's a little bit of a historical tangent, though. Then you have Brian Leftow's view, and Leftow is going to defend a position where he says something along the lines of, look, when it comes to the one God, he has three life streams, and when it comes to the one God, he lives his one life in three. He lives his one self in three streams. So he kind of gives this example. Brian Leftow.
What's his faith?
Catholic.
That sounds kind of new agey almost. He lives in three streams.
Well, so he borrows this concept of modes from John Locke. And Locke basically said, and Locke is... Yep, Locke is himself a philosopher in the 16th century, and for him, he explains how bare particulars can be lives, like the life of a tree is made up of more simple entities. And he explains it by saying, look, when they organize in this way, they form a life or a mode. And, well, okay, maybe God is just one mode of life. Okay, like even the Bible says he is a living God. So, all right, so he is a living God. He lives, and he lives in a certain way. Yeah,
John.
Yeah, can you hear me? Test 1 2.
I'm here.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Are you? Okay, we're good.
Okay, the last thing I heard was. I can't remember the last thing I heard now.
Oh, I think I want to. Oh, well, I'll go back to the Bible.
Oh, yeah. He's taking the Bible says God is a living God, and then you're about to say something.
Right. I was going to say that God is alive in some way. Oh, Starlight says it's you who froze. Oh, okay. That would explain it. Thank you, guys.
Froze. Okay. Thank you, Haley.
All right. So Brian Leftow would explain, okay, so God has one mode of life. And he has a mode of life in the sense that God is a conscious being. God is a conscious entity. So as a conscious entity, God thinks he has a pattern of beliefs that's organized in a logical way. Of course, Brian Leftow doesn't believe he's phenomenally conscious in the sense you or I have phenomenal consciousness, but rather God.
What is phenomenal consciousness?
So your ability to see colors, hear sounds, register them in your own mind.
Okay.
Yeah. So the stuff that registers like qualitative stuff around you. Like God doesn't have like a conscious apparatus where he hears sounds and he's seeing lights or that sort of thing. Instead, God has an intellect, and God's intellect grasps all truth and knowledge, and it's structured in a certain way where certain things follow from other certain things. So think of like a mathematical equation. You start with like basic axioms and build up from there. So God kind of thinks in this way. His knowledge is structured in a way which is basic at one point and then just builds up to the more complex stuff. And okay, if God's mind and knowledge is organized in this way, well, maybe it's organized in this way in 3 different modes. But this is weird. Isn't this like modalism? And this is where, and this is where Leftow shines. He says, okay, no, sure, we have modes, but that's not sufficient to get us modalism. And he's right, because this is what follows. All 3 modes, in a sense, are themselves a self. But how is it possible that God is, one self who has these 3 modes? This is where he gives this fantastic analogy. Imagine you have a dancer, right? And all the other and they're part of a dance troupe. And all the other members of the dance troupe don't show up. But fortunately, this dancer, he's a break dancer in this one, but in Leftow, he uses the Rockettes. So he break dances alone. Anyone heard of the Dongle twins?
I've never heard of them. Not by name. I might know.
The name sounds familiar to me, but I can't place it.
Explain it in the comments, Holly. Explain
right.
it in the comments, and I'll put your answer up there. John, continue.
Okay, so imagine you have a guy who's alone, and all the other members of the dance troupe don't show up, and he has a bunch of people to entertain. So what does he do? He starts breakdancing, and then he runs up, and then when he's done his set, he runs off stage into the time machine. Now, of course, time machines aren't real, but let's go with it. So he goes into the time machine, and
unless it's a DeLorean.
Okay. All right. Okay. He goes into the DeLorean. He pulls back up into the past, and then he sees himself starting to breakdance. And then he puts on a new getup and a wig, and he starts breakdancing with himself. And then after they're both done, he runs off the stage and starts and does the whole process over again. He sees the 2 past selves breakdance, and then he joins them. So God is in a sense one self, but he comes back in, but he lives his life in 3 modes, remember? So one self can exist through 3 modes. And of course, this preserves the 3 persons because this one self lives on in 3 different selves at the same time, and although in different ways. Now this part's a little tricky here because you kind of run into a bit of an issue. If the self lives on in 3 lives, then isn't what happens to the 3 lives going to affect the one self again? So if Jesus is the life of God as Son, and the life of the Son dies on the cross, doesn't this mean that the Father is also going to suffer on the cross too, because they're the same self? Leftow responds by saying,
sounds like Origin.
Kind of does, yeah. Have you guys oh no, it doesn't. It just doesn't. So I'm going to say no, Jay Dyer is wrong. It doesn't solve that issue. Just going back on to the issue at hand here. So he says that, okay, look, the Father suffers in the cross, not in the same way, because it's not the life of the Father suffering, it's the life of the Son suffering. And yes, it's the same self who lives on in these 3 lives, but the thing you have to remember is it's no different than saying, a toddler can join the AARP. That's a retirement organization for senior citizens. Yeah, the child. Yeah, if you say that the old man is a child, so if there's an old guy who joins the AARP, and you say that old man is identical to his baby self, then you could say that baby self also joined the AARP. The response he would say is that's true, but it's misleading because that's not the life that's on the cross, that dies on the cross. That's not the self that's on the cross. That's another self. So that's Leftow's viewpoint. And the thing that gets me is that while it's heavy on monotheism, it does secure it. You're not going to call Leftow a polytheist. I'm not sure if modalism stuff is good enough to secure to secure the three persons. Oh, the Dongle Twins. Funny cartoon explaining Trinitarian heresies. That actually reminds me a lot of the Lutheran satire video. I really love it.
Well, yeah, she talked about that. It's like,
oh, those are the twins.
Kelly, that's.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Now I remember. Yes, that's a fantastic video. So Leftow's view is interesting. I wouldn't call it like manifestly heretical, but I do think it goes. I do think it goes against the spirit of having three persons. So there is that issue, but it's not a good one by all things considered. I have more sympathy to it than Craig's viewpoint. But
does Craig pretty much have the worst analogy?
Yeah, the Kerbis one. It is the worst analogy. I hate it.
That's a bad one. Yeah. I mean, well, and the fact.
To be fair, he would say it's not an analogy. He says it's a springboard to elucidate his model. But springboards are supposed to be helpful. If it's not helpful, then don't use it.
He's got the worst analogy on incarnation too. When he pulled the Jake Sully and Avatar thing in a debate with a Muslim apologist, I'm like, oh man, that was painful.
That was so
yeah. To be honest, I'm not really a fan of Craig. Like, it was cool to watch him debate atheists, but then I'm like, I really don't agree with these arguments. Anyway, a question from Elijah Hallberg. I just read something recently. It's from Aquinas. He says that essence is identical to person. I have never thought of this before, but it is true. It's in question 39 of the Summa.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, so Thomas has a very interesting view himself. So Thomas will call each person a substantive relation. And now at this point, you might be thinking, that's weird. Like, relations aren't persons. Oh, I think Al froze again.
Right.
So I'll just oh, no, you're good. Okay, so Thomas would say, well, they're substantive relations. Now, you might think that's weird. Substantive relations aren't persons. You can't, have a personal relation with, a relation. So, so that's one criticism that's often made of Aquinas. Another criticism is it leads to an infinite regress, because here's how he kind of explicates the idea. So imagine this. Imagine, for example, that you think of yourself. So there is the you who is thinking, and then there is the fact that you are also the subject of your own mind, because you are thinking of yourself. So those two selves, in a sense, have some kind of continuity. It's kind of like the distinction between I and me. Like, you have the third person relation, and you have the first person, you have the second person relation and the first person relation. And you could say I, me, he. So first, second, third person. So here you have like three pronouns. So that's three relations you have with yourself. Like, even if you were all alone in the universe, you could still reference yourself as a he. Unless they are your relations, and then possibly with therapy. Fair point. Okay. So at this point, isn't that like a little modalisty? Well, again, remember something about Thomas. He believes in divine simplicity. Everything that is within God, even his relations, are God.
So just explain divine simplicity to the audience,
Okay.
just in case they don't know.
Right. So the doctrine of divine simplicity states that God is not composed of any parts, either physical or metaphysical. So the physical stuff, I think we all agree. Like God doesn't have hands, ears, nose, all that stuff. He doesn't have all that.
A shin. Does God have a shin?
No, God does not have a shin.
Okay, you're going to have to take it for a few minutes.
All right.
I got someone at my door.
All right, so so we all agree God doesn't have a physical body, but what about these metaphysical parts? Well, if you look at like the medieval history of all these parts, or explaining qualities, like explaining, for example, the color of your skin or the sound of a guitar, like all these qualitative properties. They actually thought that these qualitative properties existed in the world. They're not like manifestations of your mind or your consciousness. They actually exist in and of themselves. So, and that doesn't just go for like qualitative properties as well, but things that we kind of think are bundled up in all these things. So Thomas would actually say that there's a distinction between things like existence and essence. So for example, if I was to say that I exist, and I was to say I am a human being who was born in this place and has relationships with these people, those would also be essences. Those would be, attributes or qualities about me. Thomas would actually say that existence is distinct from all of these things. So you could describe a fictional character like Harry Potter, and he's a human being. He grew up in a place. He has relations with particular people, but Harry Potter doesn't exist. I do exist. Why is that? Well, he would explain it in terms of existence being something you receive, just like you would receive any one of your physical attributes from your parents. So would you receive all these metaphysical attributes too, not from just your parents, but from other people. Thomas wants to say that God doesn't have any of these sorts of attributes. And of course, many other scholastics want to join him in that. Duns Scotus would want to join him in saying God doesn't have metaphysical attributes. So God is only one thing. Whatever that one thing is, it could have its own sets of like predicates. You could say different things about it, but you can't say that these would constitute or these would be metaphysical parts of God. You'd have to say something along the lines of, well, whatever we predicate of this one thing, yes, it's based off of what this one thing is, but it doesn't mean we're attributing anything to him that's metaphysical. So if I was to say something like God is loving, I'm not saying that God has this metaphysical quality of being loving. What I am saying is the way I understand God through his effects in the world, I can say because they come from the cause, and because, of course, whatever exists in the effect first pre-exists in the cause, I can say God is loving because whatever this one thing is, it bears out having these relationships with me. It bears out causing love to exist. It bears out having all these good qualities to exist because it's the cause of all of these things. So all the good effects we see in the world, we could attribute to God, and we could say as a result, he is good, he is loving, he is wise, and at the same time, we can say that we receive it from him. But we can't say that he is good or loving or anything in the same way we do. We say it analogically. But just because we say it analogically doesn't mean it's like a metaphor or a concept. God's love is so great, we can't even compare it to any kind of love we comprehend or see in our everyday to day basis. We have to say that God's nature is so transcendent that love is the best concept we have to make do when it comes to God himself, because everything that's great about love or great about the truth or great about goodness, it pre-exists in God in some manifestly greater way. It ends up with having a very mysterious view of what God is in and of himself, because we don't know what God is like in and of himself. We only know of God by two ways. One, through his effects in the natural world, and two, through revelation. But that doesn't mean that we can't say anything true. But it doesn't mean we can't say anything of God. We can say tons of stuff about God, but we have to understand that what we say about God is only true because it is the best that we have analogically. Everything and every analogical attribute of God is all of God. Yes, in a sense that is true, but there needs to be some clarification though, because people think that whenever we say that there are distinctions in God, or we can make distinctions of God, it doesn't mean we're just saying nothing about him. That these are all just plain concepts and metaphors. If you go to the Eunomians and of course the Nominalists later on in the 14th century, they made that same kind of claim. They said, oh well, everything that we say about God is like a synonym, because God is simple. Like, God's not made up of stuff. Our concepts are just synonymous with God. So whenever you're saying God is love, you're just saying God is God, something like that. But that is not right. And in fact, the church fathers attacked this position and said, yeah, if you take this position, you're basically saying, everything that we have from Revelation is superfluous, and is just a manifestly dumb tautology. That's not true. So even Thomas would make what's called virtual distinctions within God, and virtual distinctions are distinctions which are inseparable from the one God, that God always that don't add any diversity in God or any plurality of metaphysical parts or notions. But at the same time, we can say that there's a bit of a difference between saying God is loving and God is just and God is merciful. In God, God makes all these propositions true in an analogical sense, but the way he makes them true is going to differ. And a good way of understanding it is like this. Whenever we think of all these different distinctions in God, think of it like how you have a creator of a house, and the creator of the house is going to have an idea of what the house is going to look like in his mind. And he could draw distinctions, but these distinctions are not going to be the same distinctions that appear in the house once it is created.
Pause.
So, yeah.
Speaking of distinctions, I want you to tackle this distinction. This is probably a whole talk in itself.
Thoughts on the essence energy distinctions? I haven't read enough of Palamas to make a call about that. I like Michael Lofton from Reason and Theology. I trust him well enough because he says he affirms the distinction. So I don't really see anything theologically problematic about it. Although Father Joseph Pohl and Ludwig Ott make complaints about it, but I'm agnostic to the idea, but that's just me.
Yeah, and like for example, I showed those two books by Palamas, his dialogue with the supporter of Barlaam, and his triads, and I think he was trying to keep in mind this was an internal Orthodox issue. It's not like Photius and the Filioque or Cerularius and the Azymes. The Latins weren't part of this debate. It was an internal Orthodox debate. So therefore it didn't affect us. Now, the question is, though, at the end of the day, although it was not with us, the question is it inconsistent with what we believe? And the thing is, I think I could be, I've not read enough Palamas there, but like I've read those two books, but basically I don't find something super offensive there. I mean, it's not the same as what St. Thomas believes, but the question is it within the range of Catholic orthodoxy? And it may be more fringe position, but I'd say possibly, although I'm not an expert. So,
Starlight at Dusk asks, Father, who complains about it? Father Joseph Pohl. So Father Joseph Pohl wrote a treatise on the Trinity, and he also wrote and in that treatise, he actually complains about the Palamites. So although he was like an 18th century Catholic theologian, and to be fair, theology does improve and does take into account greater notions that might not be present, that might not have been present as it is now. So Pohl might be working with a different set of scholarly sources, but I'm not really going to but I'm not really in a position to say whether Lofton is right that it's affirmable or Pohl is right that it is not affirmable. Like, again, I don't know. But that's me. So
You want me to put that back on?
yes, from the Pohl Proust Dogmatics. That is where it is. So, but Haley actually has a good question. If Rick said God is lamp, well, you could actually say, well, I wouldn't actually say God is a lamp. Lamps, I don't think, bear out any of the perfect qualities that are really proper in speaking of God. So we could say every great attribute of a lamp can be said of God. So God is bright like a lamp, but in a much grander sense. But generally, you want to go higher. And so another way of understanding it is like this: the medievals had a very different understanding of existence than we do. For them, existence existed on a hierarchy. So at the bottom, you had rocks and stones, things that were inanimate, and then you had on a higher level things like plants, vegetation, things which had a moving soul, but were simple. Basically can soak in sunlight, take in oxygen, that sort of thing. And then you had animals who could move them, who were able to exercise some degree of control and instinct. Then you have rational animals like human beings. And then you have not animals, then you have angels who are rational substances without bodies. And then you have God. So as you go up the hierarchy, you have more rational beings. So what is this hierarchy based off of? Well, they said that all of existence has its source in three qualities: the true, the good, and the beautiful. And the more truth and goodness and beauty there is, and of course being is a part of all of that, the higher on the hierarchy it is. So human beings have a greater breadth of all of these things than anything lower than them, but the angels have these in a much higher quality too, which is why it's sadder when angels turn to demons, because there's a greater fall in place. There's a greater perversion. God himself is if you read Duns Scotus, he'll say God is infinite being. If you read Thomas Aquinas, he'll say God is being itself. So if you go higher on the hierarchy, then God is, going to be the greatest instance of any sort of thing under it. And God will then be being itself, because what has more being than being itself? Or what is going to be higher in existence than something which is infinite being? Something like that. So, and this is why we say God is the cause of all of the lesser things in existence, because if you're an infinite being, or if you are being itself, well, you can create finite beings or created beings ex nihilo, because you lack nothing to bring them into existence. So, although I think we're kind of drifting away from the Trinity, talk into more divine simplicity. Should we shift back a little?
Who said God was beyond being? Polemus?
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Polemus holds a lot of mystery in the divine essence. But just to go back to the doctrine of the Trinity, so we talked about Leftow, we talked about William Lane Craig. There are other Trinity models too, but I'm just going to mention one more, which I like the most, and that is actually from Peter van Inwagen. So Peter van Inwagen is an Episcopalian, but if you read his article, it's called "And Yet There Are Not Three Gods, But One God." And it's a very good article. I even printed it out just to take notes. But you could find this online just by searching it. So here it is. Oh.
Is it in a journal or?
It is actually in a journal, but you can find it online if you just search. And yet there are not three gods, but one God, Peter Van Inwagen, Inwagen. It's a bit technical because he actually writes out the Trinity formula in what's called relative identity logic. And relative identity logic basically says, yeah, I see that there's this thing called absolute identity, and I know there's predication, but maybe there's like a kind of a sort of special identity that's not so stringent. So I'm going to have to explain identity a little further. So please stop me if anyone gets lost, even you guys in the comments. I want to make sure it's as accessible as possible. So when you read when you read logic, we understand identity by these relations: reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity. So reflexivity is basically the law of identity, which is X is X. And that's just a tautology. It doesn't really tell you too much. Basically, everything has a relationship to itself. And then the second one is if X is equal to Y is equal to X. So basically you're saying these two names are interchangeable. So if I say Bill Clinton is the 42nd president, I say the 42nd president is Bill Clinton. Then there is transitivity. Bill Clinton, 42nd president Hillary Clinton's wife, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton's wife. You could do that, and you could do that in any way you want. So that's transitivity. Now, and of course, you have two more, which basically tell you about the properties. So if you say Bill Clinton has white hair, you have to say the 42nd president has white hair. If you say Bill Clinton is tall, you have to say the 42nd president is tall. If the 42nd president cheats on his wife, the 42nd Bill Clinton can't be all like, Hillary, that was the 42nd president. That wasn't me. If Hillary Clinton knows Leibniz's law of identity, she could easily state that, yeah, that was you. That's how identity works. And of course, besides the law of identity, there's also the law of indiscernibles. So let's say I talk about the 42nd president, and I don't know who Bill Clinton is. Like, I haven't heard that name before. And you talk about Bill Clinton, but you don't know who the 42nd president is. And we start talking and listing all their attributes, and then you're like, my guy's from Arkansas. I'm like, well, really? My guy's from Arkansas. I mean, he can't. Okay, yeah. I mean, he most likely did. But my point. So as we talk about Bill Clinton and the 42nd president, we were like, wow, these guys have so much in common. They're the same guy. They're like, if you list out all the qualities, they have to be the same person. So now those are the laws of identity that we go under. Relative identity says, that's nice, and this is a radical position, by the way. So, but again, the Trinity is a very radical doctrine. Don't be surprised if something about your worldview doesn't change in order to try to better understand it. So, there you are.
I'm just testing out something.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so in terms of relative identity, this was actually first pushed by a Catholic, Peter Geach. And Peter Geach was a great Oxford logician. And he was like, yeah, I'm not really feeling this relative identity, this absolute identity stuff. In fact, it's really a tautology. Like what does it mean to say?
When was this? Like what time period?
I think in the 60s. He's actually the husband of Elizabeth Anscombe, who was also a Catholic. They were both converts. And Peter Geach basically was, I don't like this identity stuff. Like it's just a tautology. Like if I was to say Peter is Cephas, like Peter is the same as Cephas, Geach would be like, the same what? The same apostle? Sure, the same person? Yeah. You basically say, you have to finish the sentence. Every identity claim is always relative to a sortal. So that's like a complete rejection of absolute identity. Identity is always relative to something. So what are Jesus so what is the Father and the Son? They're the same God. What are they not? They're not the same person. So same is always relative to some quality that they do or do not have. So that's how you understand like relative identity. It's always relative to some sortal. And if you're going to say that, then yeah, suddenly the whole Trinity thing isn't a problem, because just because A is the same, just because the Father is the same God as the Son doesn't mean they are the same person. After all, if we're saying identity is relative, then some things can be relative to other things, and that's fine. And Geach would also say that this absolute identity stuff is crap because, again, it's incomplete. You're not really saying anything full or substantial. So that's like Geach's take. And do you know how well received it was? Not too good. It was not well received, and for good reason. Like for example, identity is always a many one relationship. Like not only that, but we can actually, like, even if you want to say maybe the sentence is incomplete, so what? We have formal logic that actually spells out all these relationships, and it's actually not too bad. And of course, you could always say the same thing about Geach's model. You could say, what do you mean they're the same person? What do you even mean by same? You're going to have to break down same as well. Like if I was in Geach's position, I would say, look, this is just how it goes. They're the same. It's basic. I could just say if A is the same as B, then B is the same as A. Like I just go back to the rules. And oh, are you still here, Al?
Okay. Of course.
Okay.
Ooh.
Rule pilled. Okay, so this is Geach's position, and Peter Van Inwagen's like, yeah, I don't want to say absolute identity is false, but I don't want to say relative identity isn't true. Maybe some things are not captured by like a full classical explanation of identity. And Van Inwagen wants to say the Trinity should be considered one of these things. Why is it? Well, I mean, here's the thing. Every other discipline is allowed to have mysteries. I mean, how often are you going to hear like people spill guts over quantum mechanics being weird? Like people have said, oh, quantum mechanics shows contradictions or everything. I don't think that's true. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's false. But
with relativity, right?
Not with relativity. I think it's because of the observer effect. But just putting that to the side, quantum mechanics actually there was actually a quantum logic that was specifically designed where they got rid of the law of excluded middle and then just used that logic and applied it to quantum mechanics, but it never really caught on. So
did it catch on more than Geach's model?
Yeah, actually it did, which is funny because But here's the thing that we have to consider, and Peter Van Inwagen makes this point too. Look, sometimes if quantum mechanics gets to have this special logic, and there was quantum logic, and it was designed by, I think, Hilary Putnam, without the law of excluded middle, then sure, why not? In fact, even Quine himself said that even things like logic, like our most fundamental laws, if there's empirical evidence against it, and it's strong empirical evidence, then yeah, of course we're going to change the logic. But and you know what? Maybe there are some things that just go beyond us, or even disprove our very notions of identity, and the Trinity is just one of them. That could be the case. So that's Van Inwagen's point. Now, to be fair, it's not an unreasonable point. And maybe God's identity relations are just sui generis. Like God has very unique identity relations that are unlike anything else. And that brings me to the next point I want to say about the Trinity that's always overlooked. And this is something Joseph Pohl says. This is something that is stated in Ludwig Ott's Fundamental Dogmas of the Catholic Faith. You have to affirm that the Trinity is beyond reason. It's not contrary to reason, but it's beyond it. What that means is the Trinity is not something you can reason to, and it's mysterious. And to say that you can prove it, like saying it solves the many-one relationship, which is BS.
What can you reason to then?
You could reason to God's existence. You could reason to the afterlife. You can reason. You could reason to those two things.
What about Tawhid?
The oneness of God. Actually, yeah, the unity of God is a Catholic dogma. I don't deny that God is one. No one does. In fact, when it comes to God, we don't count. The reason why we can't count him on this model is because there's no numerical identity sign. We have to count by either the persons, 1, 2, 3, or the essence or being, one. God is. That's why we affirm that God is one being. And if you're saying anything else is God, well, that's the same God as the one I'm talking about. You can't have any other God. Or it's one, and that one God is one of the three, is going to be the same, is going to have a relationship where he is going to be one of those three persons. So you can make these kinds of inferences. You could say if Jesus is the same God as the Father, then you could inference the Father is the same God as Jesus. And you could also infer that the Holy Spirit is the same God as Jesus and the same God as the Father. You could affirm all of these things. Now, this doesn't mean that Leibniz's law of identity is false in every other instance, or we have to be skeptical or anything. In fact, there's a philosopher by the name of Max Black who said the indiscernibility of identities was false. So, Alan, I'm going to ask you something. Could you imagine a scenario where you have an equilateral, where you have three balls, and they are made of the same material. So 3 balls made of steel. They're equal in density, mass, weight, whatever you want to say of one, you have to say of the other 2. And they're each 5 meters apart in an equilateral shape. Can you tell? So they're each 5 miles apart from 2 other two other steel balls. Is there any way of discerning a difference between any of those things objectively? This is a symmetrical universe, by the way, that I'm asking you to imagine all these things on.
Probably, but I don't know.
Well, you can't. Well, this is actually something pushed by a philosopher named Max Black, and the idea that indiscernibles are always going to be identical is actually a very controversial thesis. It's not a thesis you can take for granted in philosophy. Well, if we could say that about this, then I think the idea that there is a manifest revelation from God that he has unique identity relations than anything else is a given. And if you read Van Inwagen's essay, he actually spells this out quite nicely, how you can have this logical system of notation without absolute identity, and it's specialized just for the Trinity. And this is and I think it's actually worth taking into account. Now, of course, people will obviously say things, and here are the criticisms. William Lane Craig says it's super ad hoc. So that's the first criticism we have to deal with. And no, it's not ad hoc because of the fact that it's there to also explain the mystery of the Trinity as well. If you're a Catholic like us, you have to believe that the Trinity is in some sense mysterious. And if we're going to say you can never get to it because the identity relationships are sui generis, then yeah, that makes sense. I don't think it's ad hoc in that sense because it explains a very important facet of the Trinity. Namely, this is not an identity relation we're very used to. It has to be mysterious in some sense. So that's the first thing to take into account. The second thing is, I don't think it's ad hoc because of the fact that whenever you have a reference to the Trinity, people reason about it just like this. Like before you ever hear of any fancy Trinity theory, you have to tell yourself, you don't make that inference. Don't make that inference. That inference is not valid. Well, why isn't it valid? Well, that's just part of the doctrine. And that's another thing Van Inwagen's theory explains really well, why Christians aren't making that inference and doing so in an orthodox manner. So I think he provides a coherent story for believers. And another thing to keep in mind, you could actually have sorts of predications. You could actually have these really nice predications, by the way, where in the same way as a legal fiction. You're more of a history guy, so are you familiar with the story of the Roman Empire having having apparently two emperors at the same time, Maximilian and what's the other guy's name? I'm trying to remember. Hold on, I'm just gonna go through my notes really quickly. Oh, here it is. Diocletian and Maximian.
So this would be about 300, right?
Right. So Van Inwagen isn't the first one to make such a claim. There's a philosopher by the name of A.P. Meretic, and he apparently draws a historical example where Diocletian adopts Maximian, and they were both ruling as one emperor. And he basically says, look, do you know what a monarchy is? It means one ruler. And if there is one ruler, then, of course, you're not going to have a multiplicity of them. One person is doing the ruling. Well, how could this be? Well, ontologically speaking, it's not like they become one person, but legally speaking, they are acting as one person. So you could say that when one of them acts in a certain way, one person acts in this way, the fictional person is acting in this way because they're the same fictional person, but they're not the same real person. So we're kind of reasoning in this way. We're not making some sort of Leibnizian inference here. And it's not like a predication of like a particular property, like they're playing one role. This is a fictional person is someone who actually does things legally. He's somebody who is passing laws, making edicts, etc., and he's ruling and looking over an empire. So he's acting as a person, and he's standing in some specific causal relationship, and it's not. And of course, Matertic. A.P. Matertic, his last name I'm probably mispronouncing, he also points out some other things. He anticipates objections. He says, no, really what was going on is there were two emperors. No, people recognized one emperor. They were just confused about the name. I don't see how this is a confusion. If this is how the name works legally, it's how it works legally. And also, if you don't like the name, then how about a memperor? Like, we're going to coin a special name for it. And he also says he also makes this point: if you're going to say there are two emperors just to keep this Leibnizian rule, then why not say that there were two empires because one was ruling over the East and one was ruling over the West? So he makes this kind of analogy, which I think is rather proper. Then someone says, well, what if they release contradictory edicts? What if one emperor releases two contradictory edicts? That could happen. So there we are. So there's a historical example. It doesn't mean we're committed to like the existence of a separate emperor being with two of these real beings. No, they exist. No, of course, that's not how it works. But what we're saying is we have valid reasoning about this, even though we don't invoke Leibniz's law. And if you can reason about it in a way which is logically valid in one context, even if it's a fictional context, why not do it in a context which isn't fictional? And there's actually a really good point that's actually brought up by Harriet Baber. She actually points out that, look, there are two ways in which you can enrich any theory. You could include more in your ontology. That is, you could say that more things exist than not. So are we going to maybe create like a functional person that really exists that's composed of two real persons? Well, that adds a lot to your ontology. It seems much simpler to say that there's a richer form of predication where you can just make these inference rules. And that's fine in terms of the legal sphere. And we're just talking about validity here. Then why can't we reason this way about God? Someone might say, well, that's different because this is about something that's real. God's real. He's not a fiction. That's true. God isn't a fiction. But at the same time, God is going to be in his identity relations, apparently, very beyond what we're used to in terms of just regular identity talk. I don't see anything spurious about this sort of logic, at the very least in the legal sphere. I'm not sure why it's spurious when it comes to God. So I think we have all that to consider. And for what it's worth, Baber defends the thesis. She actually defended the relative identity thesis in writing, although she drifted away from that in the book. Even there, she thought that Van Inwagen gave a sufficient enough answer.
So is her view more or less the same as Van Inwagen's then?
So when she was writing her articles, like in journals, she was defending Inwagen's view. She wrote 2 articles in defense of Van Inwagen's view that I've found thus far. In the book, she defends more of what's called a structuralist account of the Trinity. But I think she'd at the very least say both are legitimate. I think if she's going to defend something in a book, then it's probably going to be either one she herself holds to, or at the very least one I think she believes an audience can be more sympathetic to. So I'm not sure what her personal view is now, but at the very least, I think she's open to the idea, which is all I really need. And she's a smart person. She's a professional philosopher. So is William Lane Craig. He's also a smart guy.
And so is Inwagen, right?
So is Peter Van Inwagen. Although
is he a Calvinist, by the way? No,
actually, it's very fun. No, he's an Episcopalian. He's also an open theist. He doesn't believe God knows future propositions. He's also a Christian materialist. He doesn't believe that people have souls. He believes that people are material, and that he believes that the afterlife just consists of us rising back from the dead in our bodies. I'm not sure how he squares all. I'm not sure how he defends that particular view. But here's the thing: the guy's also very smart in other areas where I do agree with him on. I think he's really right. I think in terms of the Trinity stuff, this essay really helped me understand it a lot better.
But a question. How can he be so right on something and so wrong on something? Because open theism is just terrible.
So Inwagen's view is mostly motivated out of a defense of human libertarian free will, and he doesn't really see any logical way around God having foreknowledge and averting issues of free will. I would actually say this is an issue where Craig is actually better on than Peter Van Inwagen is on, but I think Peter Van Inwagen is better on the Trinity. I also think that it doesn't really matter if somebody is wrong in so many different areas. If they get something right, then I think it's good to just pat him on the back on this one. And Inwagen's not a dumb guy. His critiques are worth taking into account.
Oh no, I wouldn't accuse him of being dumb. Just pause for a second, Elijah. What part of Sweden is your family from? I'm only asking this if that's too personal, don't answer. I'm just asking this because I love Sweden. I love going there, and you don't have to worry about the language barrier at all because they all speak English better than we do. I'm not joking, But so God bless the Swedes. So and shout out to my buddy Restakopt here.
Yeah.
Oh, Linköping. Am I pronouncing that right? Linköping. It's an interesting pronunciation, but.
By the way, Elijah, I just want to congratulate you on your journey and thank you for considering Roman Catholicism. I myself am actually a convert from Eastern Orthodoxy. I think in terms of what really draws me to Catholicism right now, it's the fact that we have so many. Nice. I think right now, I think one of the things that draws me to Catholicism most is that there's a very rich tradition. And honestly, one of the things I really like is the fact that making the Trinity a mystery as dogmatic is actually really helpful because, well, not dogmatic, I'd say. So it's actually discussed as being, if you're trying to say that the Trinity is provable using natural reason, if you're a Catholic and you affirm that, then you are actually in proximate heresy. So you're not in heresy, but you're very close to it. Don't do that.
John, are you up for a show on this?
Yeah. That on a Catholic notion of divination, yes. If it requires, I am jurisdictionally speaking, I am Eastern Catholic, but in terms of where my affinities lie, I'm more of a Latin.
My mom's an Eastern Catholic, since we're all throwing out our since everyone seems to be throwing around Eastern affiliations. So we got a Restacopt here. We got Elijah Hallberg, who is taking a look at us, because per canon law, like if you're, say, part of Eastern Orthodoxy and you convert, you automatically become Greek Catholic.
You become a part of the rite which is adjacent to the one that you left. So if you're, I was Antiochian, I became Malachite. If you are Coptic by background, you become a Coptic Catholic. There's always going to be a corresponding jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's how canon law works. Because, like, I think back in the day, like in Canada, where both John and I live, it's probably not too big a difference. But if you live in like Western Ukraine or in Syria or in Romania or something, yeah, like you're probably like, there's probably two churches in the same town, you know. So instead of seeking out a Roman Catholic church somewhere, which is almost like impossible to find, and then go to so it's
if you are going to convert through the Latin rite, you do need the dispensation of a bishop. So that is something to consider.
Well, I thought you would convert, like if you wanted to be a Latin rite, you'd convert, then you'd swap rites.
Yeah, that's how it's done. What I'm saying, if a dispensation from that, though, would require some approval from a bishop.
Okay, guys, your questions for John Fisher 2.0.
All right. Always happy to hear. And don't just limit it to the Trinity stuff. Like, things might have gotten a bit muddled when I talked about simplicity, but I'm happy to take any questions on that too.
All right. Any questions? I told Lyndon Pretty to Oh, there's a question.
Why am I called 2.0? Because you can't improve on the original. John Fisher is a fantastic saint of the church, a great man, and I'm very honored to share his name. I would never be. I love the name John as well. John the Baptist was my patron, was the saint I was given at baptism. And of course, I have a general affinity for John Fisher because, well, let's just say this. He also was a man who was killed and condemned because he opposed an unlawful marriage. And yes, the whole Catherine of Aragon divorce, I think, was very unlawful. I know the Vatican was gearing to permit that, but I'm glad it wasn't. As far as it stands, I think that Catherine was actually pretty honest with herself. I don't think it was a lie made up that she didn't sleep with her first husband. And I would say that because Fisher would not have gone up to bat, I think, unless it was for a very good reason.
Well, sorry, go.
Oh, yeah. And I think that he was definitely right in doing what he did. And the fact that they didn't kill him on John the Baptist's feast day, because that's what they were gearing to do, actually shows that I think that even the monarchy knew that they were in the wrong. Between St. Augustine...
Yeah, just keep talking about that.
All right, so between St. Augustine and the Cappadocians, I think St. Augustine has a Trinity model, which I think they were trying to do two different things. So the Cappadocians have the better model because the Cappadocians were actually mostly in the thick of things. Augustine himself was trying to communicate their ideas to a Latin audience. And while he did do as great a job as he did or could do, given his position, I don't think he was writing in terms of a systematic theology. I think he was more trying to explain to people, using the best analogies that he could, certain ways of trying to wrap their heads around what was going on. And I think in terms of that, Augustine did keep a lot more of it mysterious. And I think he was right to do so. So I think Augustine's model is one that I don't think is as good as the Cappadocians, but to be fair, I think the Cappadocians just had more room to work with.
And while we're on the topic of John Fisher, this is the bio you want to read about John Fisher.
The actual John Fisher, the good John Fisher.
Have you read this one, John?
Actually, I have. I believe I read the section on grace was actually very informative.
Okay, are you sure we're
Wait,
talking
wait,
about the same book?
wait. Are you talking about his biography?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Oh, no, not that one. Sorry, I'm reading a different. I'm thinking of the one on his theology.
It's published by Mediatrix Press, which
Ooh.
we all know is Ryan Grant's uh, his publication arm.
Ryan Grant, by the way, gives a fantastic lecture on the life of John Fisher.
Oh yeah,
I would also suggest that
that
after
inspired
this,
me to buy this book. By the way,
I suggest for anyone watching this who doesn't want to fork over money to buy the book because times are tough. At the very least, do yourselves a favor: search up Ryan Grant, John Fisher. It's a fantastic lecture. I'd highly recommend it.
Okay, here's a very important one. What should one do when he hears blasphemy by customers at work? Where do you work? A store or a restaurant or what?
At work, I used to just say "Blessed be His name" whenever someone said Jesus Christ's name in vain. So that's one way of doing it. It might seem a little, extra, but yeah, go for it. Why not? And if you don't feel brave enough to do that, then at the very least, just say it out. Just say it under your breath for the person's soul.
Okay, these aren't really. Weren't apathetic though, or enough. Or to use the word God. Cash.
Yeah, yeah, that might be a little trickier. At the very least, keep them in. At the very least, I would say say "Blessed be His name" at the very least under your breath. That's what helped me. And making reparations and the signs of the cross is also very good as well. Oh, so Elias asks, do Christological views have the potential of bringing distinct, perhaps contradictory models of the Trinity? So, funny enough, Peter Van Inwagen has an essay that I'm going to read after I am finished with the Trinity on relative identity and the incarnation. So, that I'm going to work on a little later. But I would say that as a matter of faith, no, we cannot affirm that there's a contradiction. These things cannot be contrary to reason, but only over them. And to affirm that they're a contradiction is to affirm that they are contrary to reason. If a contradiction isn't contrary to reason, I don't know what is. Although there is actually a philosopher by the name of J.C. Beale, and he actually argues that the hypostatic union is a contradiction, and he's a Christian, and he says because it's a contradiction, as Christians, we should affirm it. We should affirm that, yeah, it is a true contradiction. And that's not really a bad thing because, philosophers actually are open to this idea now. We actually have a diathletic sort of logic that allows us to affirm contradictions.
That sounds like something the adherents of a certain Abrahamic fan fiction would like to say.
So yes, but here's I do know of one Muslim who actually cited this as this is proof, like this is what the Christians have to go through in order to affirm the incarnation, how it's such a contradiction. And to be fair, I'd say that here's the thing: Christians shouldn't be affirming that because if one thing our fathers of the faith made clear is we didn't affirm the heresies because they were contradictory. And they use this sort of reasoning as a way of vindicating conciliar Christianity. So if anyone is interested, Tim Paul, Pawl, he's a philosopher at St. Thomas Seminary, and he writes a lot about conciliar Christology. If you want a good, solid traditional defense of it, I'd say look him up.
Is that SXPX Seminary?
No.
Okay. Okay, so
I think maybe it's University of St. Thomas, but
or is it Thomas Aquinas College?
Possibly. Here, I'll search it up really quickly.
So, and while we're winding down on time, I kind of want to kill the stream at 1 hour and 30, so we got 5-6 minutes left. So, John, right now I've been reading a lot of this book here. I've been reading the current book in the Wetcher series. Now, unfortunately, you can't learn a lot of philosophy from this book. So I'm going to ask you to give a recommended reading list here.
For the Trinity specifically?
Yeah, we know that article from Van Inwagen, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I would say if there are 3 books you should get on the Trinity, it would probably be first, Christianity and Paradox by James Anderson. Anderson doesn't argue for a specific model of the Trinity or a specific model of the incarnation. He actually says that I can't make heads or tail of either of these things. I think they're paradoxical. But a paradox isn't a contradiction. It just means that there just appears to be one because of the finitude of human reasoning. And he actually gives a defense of how Christians can affirm paradoxes and still be justified. And to be fair, it's not like we don't do it in some way. So there's a thing called the liar's paradox. So this sentence is false. If this sentence is false, doesn't that mean it's true? And if it's true, doesn't that mean it's really false? So some people say this is actually an example of a contradiction. I don't think contradictions happen, so I think that there's probably some trick to it that I don't know. It's a paradox. It seems to be a contradiction.
We don't believe in Abrahamic fan fiction. I mean, despite the fact that John comes from a country where there's a lot of Abrahamic fan fiction.
All right, let's not. Okay, come. I think we want to be a little nice to the Muslims if they're watching this. Sorry. All right, so I have made that jab before, yes, and yeah, you kind of make fun of things behind closed doors, but public places.
Okay, I won't.
All right, so that's the first book, Christianity and Paradox by James Anderson, and that's the first book I would recommend. The second book I would recommend is by Harriet Baber. Let's see, Harriet Baber. I'm trying to remember the book. The Trinity, A Philosophical Investigation. So that's the second book I would recommend. It's a lot easier to understand than like a journal entry. If you're interested in like the very precise logic behind all this, Van Inwagen's article, I'd suggest that too. And the last one I would suggest is a patristic one, St. Augustine's The Trinity. So
that one I've read. It's a beaut, guys. It's a beaut. I mean, he's a saint for a reason.
Now notice I didn't give anything in terms of my specific theory, which is relative identity, aside from Peter Van Inwagen's article. So those are the 3 books if you want to read out a popular level. If you want to see my solution, and it requires a bit of technical language and knowledge of logic in general. But Peter Van Inwagen tries to give a step-by-step introduction. So his is the first one I'd recommend. The second one would be Harriet Baber's Trinity Redux. So that's the second journal article I would recommend as well. And the third one, which I'd recommend, is actually on Duns Scotus's notion of the Trinity, and it's by Richard Cross. If this is a more historical one, but I'd also recommend this too as well. So Richard Cross's article on the Trinity, and I'd say those are probably the 3 journal sources if you want to get my own perspective. But the popular books are very good if you don't want to understand all these philosophy models. I would recommend Anderson's book just because of the fact that it provides a pretty good way of understanding how you can be firm and understand your faith while affirming a mystery. I actually published a video on Anderson's book, but I didn't want to publish it until I understood a lot of what are called the semantic elements behind it, because you have to understand what you're saying when you say that the Trinity is 1 and the Trinity is 3. Anderson holds a very analogical view of God and divine language, and I really can't do it justice myself. And if you affirm like all the stuff Thomas Aquinas says about how we speak about God analogically and by speaking of God through his effects and through the language given by revelation, then yes, that's perfectly fine as well. So I'd say that that's a really good book if you want to understand the Trinity.
All right, some words of praise by Hallie. Thank you, Hallie. I only bring the experts on my channel, so that's why John's here.
Oh, again, not an expert.
Well, all right. I guess that's it. Do you have any final words? I think you've. Well, if you want to.
Final words. Actually, how much time do we have left?
Not a lot.
Okay, in that case, I'll just say, I arise today through a mighty strength in the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through the confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, and Christ in me. Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left. Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down. Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me. Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me. Christ in the eye of everyone who sees me. Christ in every ear that hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength of the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. Amen.
Amen. All right. God bless everyone.